During the 1950s and 60s, Martin Luther King Jr. and the foot soldiers of the American Civil Rights Movement, such as Congressman John Lewis, took a stand against the injustices of segregation in the United States through civil disobedience and nonviolent protests. Jim Crow laws and the Plessy v. Ferguson Supreme Court decision legally upheld racial segregation laws on the basis of African Americans being separate but equal. Dr. King continuously advocated for nonviolence throughout the civil rights movement, regardless of whether or not the opposing side resorted to violence. Dr. King was inspired by Henry David Thoreau's essay Civil Disobedience, where Thoreau stated that citizens have a moral responsibility to break unjust laws that are put in place to oppress a minority. King also believed that breaking any law believed to be unjust would force the oppressors to hear the objection of the minority. As King stated in his 1964 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, "Our aim is to persuade." He believed that actions of civil disobedience against unjust laws would persuade lawmakers to re-examine such laws. The citizens of the current and future generations who wish to fight injustice should be inspired by the success of the civil rights movement. They should adopt the principles of a nonviolent campaign when becoming a part of a movement. King not only believed that violence was wrong, but that it would not work to achieve justice. As he stated in a 1966 interview,
"I will never change in my basic idea that nonviolence is the most potent weapon available to the Negro in his struggle for freedom and justice. I think for the Negro to turn to violence would be both impractical and immoral."
The men and women of the civil rights movement proved that in order to lead a successful campaign for justice, it is necessary to become a part of a nonviolent movement that upholds the peaceful principles of civil disobedience.
We are encouraged. We're not going to fight our white brethren with malice, nor are we going to fight them with any falsified stories, nor are we going to fight them with hatred, but we're going to fight them with love. When they hate us, we're going to absorb their hatred in love.
I grew up in rural Alabama, about 50 miles from Montgomery, outside of a little town called Troy. When we would visit Troy, go to the movie, all of us little black children had to go upstairs to the balcony, and all of the little white children went downstairs to the first floor. I would come home and ask my mother, my father, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, why? They would say, "That's the way it is. Don't get in the way. Don't get in trouble." So individuals like Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King Jr. inspired me to get in the way, to get in trouble, what I call good trouble.
So exactly what is good trouble? The idea that Congressman Lewis proposes about getting in the way comes from the methods of Thoreau's essay, Civil Disobedience. Britannica defines civil disobedience as the refusal to obey the demands or commands of a government or occupying power, without resorting to violence or active measures of opposition. Its usual purpose is to force concessions from the government or occupying power. Essentially, civil disobedience is about one's obligation to their values as an individual or a moral standard held by a larger group. The acts of civil disobedience are about violating laws that in the mind of the disobedient are immoral or unjust. It is not about rejecting the system as a whole. So what did civil disobedience mean for the civil rights movement? In Dr. King's 1964 Nobel Peace Prize acceptance speech, he stated, "Violence never brings permanent peace. It solves no social problem. It merely creates new and more complicated ones. Violence ends up defeating itself." In his letter from a Birmingham jail, King describes the 4 steps necessary in a nonviolent campaign.
Collection of the facts to determine whether injustices exist, negotiation, self-purification, and direct action.
One of the most famous acts of civil disobedience was when Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on a Montgomery bus to a white person when there were no other seats. This decision by Ms. Parks fueled a citywide boycott and essentially inspired nationwide movements to end segregation of public facilities.
During the 60s, because of the inspiration of Dr. King and Rosa Parks, I was arrested 40 times for sitting in or going on the freedom rides, beaten, left bloody, unconscious. that I started studying the way of peace, the way of love, studying the philosophy of nonviolence, studying the teaching of Gandhi, studying Thoreau and civil disobedience. And we started sitting in at lunch counters, in restaurants. And people would come up and spit on us, put lighted cigarettes out in our hair, down our backs. And they told us if we continued to sit in, we would get arrested. We would be taken to jail.
So you got arrested.
So I got arrested.
The civil rights sit-in was a tactic added to the nonviolent measures of the civil rights movement in 1960. 4 black college students sat at a whites-only lunch counter in North Carolina and were refused service. Despite the threats, the boys remained seated and peacefully waited to be served. In the event of violent attacks, they would curl up in a ball on the floor and accept the punishment. They believed that any violent retaliation would undermine the goal of the sit-in. Sit-in organizers were confident that if violence was only witnessed on the part of the white community, the world would see the just nature of their cause. Eventually, because of the determination of sit-in participants like Congressman Lewis, restaurants throughout the South no longer upheld policies of segregation, and the protesters had started the path to victory. During a march from Selma to Montgomery, John Lewis was beaten so badly by a police officer that his skull was fractured. However, in the face of defeat and horrible injustice, he kept going and he did not give up.
On the bridge, as we attempted to march from Selma to Montgomery, when we were beaten, hospitalized, I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. I thought that attempt to march was my last nonviolent protest. But I kept going because I saw something that was not right, not fair, not just, and I wanted to do something about it.
Even after being physically beaten and hospitalized, Congressman Lewis never resorted to violence. He had been taught, as many others, by Dr. King that violence is not the answer.
We know through painful experience that freedom is never voluntarily given by the oppressor. It must be demanded by the oppressed. Frankly, I have yet to engage in a direct action campaign that was well timed in the view of those who have not suffered unduly from the disease of segregation.
King believed that America was a place of greatness and freedom because people had the right to stand up for themselves and for their liberties. In fact, Dr. King wrote his letter from a Birmingham jail while he was incarcerated himself. He was arrested for being a participant in a nonviolent campaign. Still, whenever he spoke, he declared that nothing could stop the movement for civil rights, and that the laws could get in their way but could not turn them around.
Somewhere I read that the greatness of America is the right to protest far right. And so just as I say we aren't going to let any dogs or water hoses turn us around, we aren't going to let any injunction turn us around.
I think it's important for this generation to read the literature of the movement, watch the films, the videos, and become part of an effort that is so good and so decent that you're prepared to stand up for it, speak up and speak out, and put your body on the line for what you believe in.
When they speak against us, we're going to speak things of love toward them. We're not going to let their hatred turn us around, but we're going to love them on every side. Oh,